Hello friends, welcome to my channel Odyssey Parry. Dare to be wise. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe to my channel. Okay, today I am going to discuss about my third lecture on inflammation, where I am going to discuss about the chronic inflammation, concept of giant cell and the important questions related to the inflammation which are frequently asked in your written and as well as in VIVA. Okay, so let's start. What is chronic inflammation? In my last lecture, I have discussed about the fate of acute inflammation, where I have said that if the injurious agent which is the cause of inflammation, if it persists, if it cannot be removed, then there are certain fate like chronic inflammation, suppuration, abscess formation, fistula formation, sinus formation, etc. Chronic inflammation is one of them. What happens when the injurious agent persists? The acute inflammatory cells are unable to remove that cause. For example, a bacteria, it is, it has multiplied too much, so much that the acute inflammatory cells are unable to remove it. What will happen? The inflammation will persist. So what is chronic inflammation? Chronic inflammation can be defined as an inflammation of prolonged duration due to persistent presence of infection, immune mediated inflammatory disease, prolonged exposure to any toxic agent in which inflammation, tissue damage and attempt to repair occurring simultaneously but varying in combination. So I have first discussed due to persistent presence of infection. Okay. Next one is immune mediated inflammatory disease. For example, arthritis. Arthritis, it's a chronic inflammatory disease. It is immune mediated, autoimmune disease. So these are the stuff. Okay. So next is prolonged exposure to any toxic agent. Uh, a poison, when taken in very minute quantity, it gets accumulated in the body and it produces inflammation in your body, and this inflammation is prolonged. Why? Because you are taking the poison in minimum quantity for a prolonged duration. Okay, for example, occupational hazards, you know so here there will be inflammation, chronic variety of inflammation. Okay, where inflammation, tissue damage and attempts to repair will be occurring simultaneously but varying in combination. What does it mean by the varying in combination? Look, inflammation is occurring, tissue damage is occurring simultaneously. One group. After tissue damage, there will be attempt to repair. There will be tissue damage and attempt to repair simultaneously. Another group. And again, after, as it is going for a prolonged duration, so attempt to repair has been done, again there will be inflammation. So this is another group combination. So these combinations will be occurring there. So now I'm going to discuss about the types of chronic inflammation. So I'm moving on to my next slide. Chronic non-specific inflammation, chronic granulomatous inflammation. So first one is chronic non-specific inflammation. Here the inflammation, type of inflammation, the variety of inflammation, the pattern of inflammation is non-specific. No certainty there. Okay, it doesn't follow any pattern. Only inflammation, chronic inflammation occurring with formation of granulation tissue, and healing is done by fibrosis. Okay, in my last lecture, in the fate of acute inflammation, I have said if the tissue damage is so extensive, there will be healing by fibrosis and granulation tissue. What is granulation tissue? Granulation tissue means new connective tissue. Okay, new connective tissue with newly formed microscopic blood vessels. What is granulation tissue? Granulation tissue is nothing but new connective tissue and newly formed microscopic blood vessels. That is called granulation tissue. Okay, and healing is done by fibrosis. Fibrosis means I have already discussed in my last videos. I will give the link of my last videos in the description box. Fibrosis means where the fibroblasts comes and fibrin threads are accumulated and collagens are formed. Okay, so in this way fibrosis occurs. And why fibrosis is occurring? Because you need to compensate the lost tissue, the lost tissue you need to compensate, you need to fill that gap. That makes the fibrosis makes that gaps to be filled. Okay, so what are the examples? Chronic osteomyelitis, chronic ulcer, chronic cholecystitis, any kind of inflammation, chronic inflammation, that is chronic non-specific inflammation. Next one is chronic granulomatous inflammation. Here, chronic granulomatous inflammation, if I want to define granulomatous inflammation, the definitions will be any chronic inflammation characterized by formation of granuloma. Okay, I will discuss about granuloma right now. What is granuloma? Look, granuloma is granuloma is a circumscribed tiny lesion, multiple circumscribed tiny lesions about 1 millimeter in diameter, composed of predominantly modified macrophages called epithelioid cells, and that is rimmed at the periphery by lymphocytes. Sometimes plasma cells may be there, which may be surrounded by a collar of fibrous tissue if it is present for a prolonged duration. Look, what is granuloma? Granuloma is typically seen in tuberculosis and histoplasmosis. Uh, in tuberculosis or histoplasmosis, there is caseous necrosis. You have learned, I think, or I will discuss when I will be publishing my videos on necrosis. That is caseous necrosis, where in the center there is lysed or fragmented cells in the center. Surrounding that, there will be presence of epithelioid cells. These are actually modified macrophages. Modified macrophages are called epithelioid cells, and that will be surrounded by other inflammatory cells like lymphocytes, plasma cells sometimes. And if it gets old, then it will be rimmed or collared outside by fibrous tissue due to healing process. Okay, that is granuloma, where there is presence of these kind of tiny circumscribed lesions, centrally present modified macrophages, activated macrophages called epithelioid cells. Surrounding to it, there will be lymphocytes and other inflammatory cells, and surrounding there will be fibrous, fibrous tissue. So this is called as granuloma. So whenever in chronic inflammation you find granuloma, that is granulomatous inflammation. It is showing a certain pattern, granuloma, certain pattern. So this is granulomatous inflammation. Okay. Example: tuberculosis, leprosy, histoplasmosis. Histoplasmosis is a systemic fungal disorder where histoplasma capsulatum is a fungus which is causing histoplasmosis. Okay. So that is chronic granulomatous inflammation. Next, chronic inflammation part is done. Moreover, more or less, now I'm going to discuss about the concept of giant cell. What is giant cell? Look, I have discussed about granuloma. What is granuloma? Circumscribed tiny lesion where centrally there is modified macrophages called as epithelioid cells. The basic concept is these epithelioid cells, when fused with each other, when these epithelioid cells are fused with each other, they forms a large cell with multiple nucleus, that is known as giant cell. Okay, you got it? When the epithelioid cells are fused with each other, in the granuloma there is epithelioid cells, and these epithelioid cells, when fused with each other and produce a large cell, then we call it a giant cell. It contains 20 or more nucleus. It contains 20 or more nucleus, and the size varying from 40 to 50 microns. Okay, so this is the basic concept of giant cell. Many students gets confused. If you study sequentially, it is more easy to understand what is giant cell, so this is giant cell. And the giant cells are of two types. One is physiological giant cell, another is pathological giant cell. Physiological giant cells are osteoclastic cell. Actually, look what happens. Monocyte, when it is present in the blood, it is known as monocyte. When it is present in the tissue, it is known as macrophages, right? So these macrophages in different tissue are named differently. In the bones, these are called osteoclastic cells. In the central nervous system, it is known as glial cell. In the liver, it is known as Kupffer cell. In the lungs, it is known as alveolar cells. In the spleen and lymph nodes, it is known as histiocytes. Okay. Uh, then in the kidney, it is known as Lassis cell or mesangial cell. Okay, so these are the macrophages in different area, in different resident cells are known as different. They are named differently. Okay, so when these macrophages fuse with each other, they makes giant cell, and these giant cell are like osteoclastic cells, megakaryocyte of bone marrow, megakaryocytic cells of bone marrow, also giant cell, and trophoblastic cell of placenta. These are the examples of physiological giant cell. Okay, next there is pathological giant cell. Pathological giant cells are again divided into two types: giant cell of inflammation, giant cell of tumor. Giant cell of inflammation are of four types. First is foreign body giant cell. Foreign body giant cell are typically found in chronic granuloma, okay, like leprosy or tuberculosis. These are foreign body giant cell. Next one is Langerhans giant cell. Langerhans giant cell means it is typically seen in tuberculosis and sarcoidosis. Okay. Next, Totten giant cell. Totten giant cell is seen in xanthoma. Okay, xanthoma. Next is Asaph giant cell. Asaph giant cell is seen in, these are actually derived from the cardiac histiocytes. Cardiac histiocytes means here macrophages. They are derived from the cardiac macrophages, and these are seen in rheumatic nodule, rheumatic heart disease. When there is rheumatic heart disease, within the rheumatic nodule, Asaph giant cells are present. Okay. Next one is the next variety is giant cell of tumor. Giant cell of tumor is of three types: anaplastic cancer giant cell. These cells are actually larger, have numerous nuclei which vary in shape and size. Okay, anaplastic giant cell, these are larger in size, numerous, and the nuclei vary in shape and size. Okay. Next one is Reed-Sternberg cell. It is very important. It is very important to remember Reed-Sternberg cell. It is typically seen in case of Hodgkin's disease or Hodgkin's lymphoma. Okay, these are actually owl eye-like cells. Okay, these are very important, very important. Reed-Sternberg cell present in the Hodgkin lymphoma or Hodgkin's disease. It is the characteristic of Hodgkin's disease. One of the most important identification point of Hodgkin's disease. Next one is giant cell of tumor of bone. Look, the tumor of bone has an uniform distribution of osteoclastic giant cells spread in the stroma. of that tumor, the supporting tissue, within the supporting tissue of that tumor of the bone, the osteoclastic cells has that uniform distribution. Okay, that is actually the giant cell of tumor of bone. The osteoclastic giant cell shows an uniform distribution in the stroma of the tumor of the bone. This is known as giant cell of tumor of bone. Okay, now today's topic has been done. I have completed the whole topic of inflammation. Now I shall be discussing about the questions which are asked from inflammation. Very important questions. These are the important questions. The list is here. You can take a snapshot. Definition of inflammation. What are the vascular events and cellular events of acute inflammation? I have covered it in my first video. Describes what are the fate of acute inflammation. I have discussed in the second video. What is chronic inflammation? What are the types of it? Okay. I have discussed it in the third video. What is the key cell of acute inflammation? It is neutrophil, because all the function is done by neutrophil in acute inflammation. So what is the key cell of acute inflammation? That is neutrophil. Okay, the short notes. Exudate. I have discussed it in my first video, yes, in my first lecture on inflammation, where I have discussed about the permeability of the microcirculation. Due to the permeability of the microcirculation and increased hydrostatic pressure and decreased osmotic pressure, the protein rich fluid which comes from the vascular compartment to the area to the interstitium, which produces the tumor, the swelling of the area of inflammation, is known as exudate. The fluid is exudate and the process is exudation. Okay, so that is exudate. So it is exudate. I have discussed it in my first video. Okay, so exudate has following characteristics, like exudate, specific gravity of exudate is more than 1.018 and protein content is more than 2 gram per dl. Okay, it is like cloudy, viscous fluid. Okay, and it causes non-pitting edema because it has got so much protein with it, so it causes non-pitting edema. Okay, so this is exudate. Giant cell I have discussed. Plasma cell I didn't discuss, but plasma cell is also asked in your exam. Next is fate of acute inflammation. I have discussed it. Granuloma discussed today. Phagocytosis discussed in my second video. Diapedesis, transmigration discussed in second video. Chemical mediators of inflammation. Chemical mediators of inflammation, actually I have not discussed. I think chemical mediators of inflammation I have discussed in various stages of my lectures. Vascular events and cellular events. During discussion of vascular events and cellular events, I have discussed about the chemical mediators of inflammation, various chemical mediators which are responsible in various steps of inflammation, which regulates various steps of inflammation. Neutrophil, you have learnt in physiology. It can be asked in pathology too. Difference between acute inflammation and chronic inflammation, you can make it by yourself. The differences I have discussed both of them. Next, exudate, transudate. Exudate is due to an inflammatory process. Transudate is a non-inflammatory process. Normal filtration of fluid. In exudation, there is increased hydrostatic pressure with increased permeability of the microcirculation. In transudate, there is only due to increased hydrostatic pressure. There is no permeability, increased permeability. Exudate more than 1.018 specific gravity, transudate less than 1.018. Exudate protein content more than 2 gram per dl, transudate less than 2 gram per dl. Exudate produces non-pitting edema, transudate produces pitting edema. These are the things. Another concept is granuloma and granulation tissue. I have discussed today. These students gets confused with granuloma and granulation tissue. Granuloma is it At the last it is OMA. We know that OMA means benign tumor, but granuloma is not a benign tumor. It is actually type 4 hypersensitivity. Type 4 hypersensitivity. I will discuss about hypersensitivity later on my in my videos. So granuloma is a type 1 hypersensitivity where centrally presence of macrophage, around it there will be lymphocytes, plasma cells sometimes, and surrounding to it there will be color of fibrous tissue. That is granuloma. And granulation tissue is, it is a process of healing, okay, where the tissue damage is extensive, so much tissue has been lost, so there should be formation of new cells from the stem cells, new connective tissue, fibrosis, okay, with newly formed blood vessels. This is granulation tissue. This is the difference between granuloma and granulation tissue. Neutrophil and lymphocyte, you have learnt it in physiology too. These are the differences and definition. Granuloma exudate pus, opsonization, chemotaxis. I have discussed about pus in the second lecture of my inflammation. So these are the questions. Thank you. Thank you so much. Please do like, share, comment and subscribe to my channel. If you want anything else, you can tell me in the comment section below. And thank you so much.